I'm just, how far, can I stand here and still be nicely audible to everyone? Okay, good. I think that this posture might sort of get a little psychologically heavy after a few minutes. So here we go. Welcome, everyone, physically present and online, to the new Regionalisms chat. It's great to see you here today. We've got three amazing authors with us today. What I'm going to do is introduce each of them one at a time, and they're going to come up and offer a brief reading that invites us into the work that I think is going to inform a lot of our conversation today. So let's dive in. Aaron, we'll start with you. Aaron Schneider is a queer settler living in London, Ontario. He is the founding editor at the Thames Review and chapbook publisher at 845 Press, and an assistant professor in the Department of Writing Studies at Western University. His stories have appeared in a variety of journals and have been nominated for the Journey Prize and the Pushcart Prize. His novella, Grass-Fed with Quattro Books, was published in fall 2018. His collection of experimental short fiction, What We Think We Know, with Gordon Hill Press, was published in fall 2021. And The Supply Chain with Crow's Nest Books is his first novel that he'll be reading with us today. Please welcome Aaron.
I'm just going to start with the beginning of the book because I think it's easiest, and also it's very, well, as you'll see, it's very London. And I think that's appropriate to this panel. So this is just the beginning of the first section. London, Ontario is an ugly city. That is not what the official documents say, what the slogan says. In promotional pamphlets that you can pick up at the Welcome Center on Wellington Road, in front of which is the synthetic tree aimed at solar panel leaves at the sky, or at the Tourism London office on the ground floor of a building downtown. On these glossy accordion pages, on signs spaced out along the 401 and on municipal letterhead, it is the forest city, and the city that people mean when they call it that is filled with trees. In the neighborhoods of Old North, Wortley Village, and Woodfield, towering maples shelter the streets and filter a soothing, watery light onto late Victorian homes. These houses are built out of the city's signature yellow brick, and the light falls uniformly on their long porches, on their dormers, on their stained glass valances, and the ornately detailed woodwork of their doors, on their Gothic flourishes and Italianate turrets, on their slate roofs whose tiles are weathered, their outlines softened by chipping, and on their surfeit of rooms. Here, the trees are as old and as stately as the houses they shade, and the houses are lovingly cared for. And the most impressive are designated heritage resources of priority level 1 or 2, the highest priority levels available in the province, and identified by round metal plaques bearing the city's coat of arms: an elk, a bear, a smoking locomotive above the motto Labore et Perseverantia, or through labor and perseverance, on their gateposts or mounted on the brick next to their letterboxes. They are owned by doctors and lawyers, by senior managers and vice presidents, by couples who are both university professors who bought them recently and who explain proudly to their friends that they are house poor, or by retired high school teachers who were lucky enough to buy them in the 70s and 80s before the real estate market began its relentless climb, and they could still afford them. These are the neighborhoods that are shown off to visitors. They are the city that everyone means when they say London, Ontario. But they are not the real city. The real city sprawls out from them. For decades, developers have been building south towards the 401, north and east and west, carving new subdivisions out of cornfields, laying down looping roads, crescents and ways lined with houses whose garages are thrust towards the street and whose front doors are set back from it. These houses are thrown up in a rush and all at once by companies with names like Artisan Homes, Heritage Construction, and Rembrandt Properties. Each house's facade is a standardized variation on a common theme: peaked roof, dormer, picture window, often a bay window with 3 panels, but sometimes a single flat window with a simple transom above it, that has evolved over time, but never changed enough to become something recognizably different. They are as spacious as the houses in Old London. Inside, they have open concept layouts, great rooms that flow past courts or granite-capped islands into kitchens under yawning cathedral ceilings. Buyers can choose from an extensive range of options to personalize the floor plans and the finishes. Everyone picks the oversized back deck, but the most remarkable feature of these houses is always their price, shockingly low if you're from Toronto, surprisingly high if you're from anywhere else. Their front lawns are no bigger than their driveways, and the trees planted on these lawns or on the close-cropped ribbon of grass between the sidewalk and the curb are barely as tall as a person. Their narrow trunks are supported by iron stakes and protected by perforated plastic sleeves. No one puts these neighborhoods in the city's promotional materials or in the banners of municipal web pages. No one thinks about them when they say London, Ontario. But this is where the balance of the city's more than 400,000 residents live. This is where Matt Nowak lives, in a house in Killarney Road in the Cedar Hollow development in northeast London, with his wife, Ruth, his wife of 4 years, and his newborn son, who he does not love. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Aaron. Next, we have Brooke Lockyer. Brooke holds a BA from Barnard College and an MA in English in the field of creative writing from the University of Toronto. She is the winner of the 2009 Hart House Literary Contest and a co-recipient of both the Peter S. Prescott and the Lenore Marshall Barnard Prizes for Prose. Her work has been published in Toronto Life, Carte Blanche, the Hart House Review, Whitehall Review, and Geist. Born in Southwestern Ontario, she's lived in rural Japan, New York City, Bristol, and the Mojave Desert. She currently resides with her family in Toronto, and Burr, published with Nightwood Editions, is her first book that she'll be reading from today. Welcome, Brooke.
Thanks so much, Misha, and thank you to Josh and everyone at Words for having me. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you everyone for coming to listen. As Misha mentioned, this is my first book, Burr, and it's a Southern Ontario Gothic about not wanting to let go of the dead. It's composed of short chapters with different narrators, including one voiced by the town of Burr. I'm going to start with a Burr chapter. Unlike unassuming Paris or the nearby village of Dublin, Burr lives up to its name. The prickly fruit is everywhere in this flat southwestern Ontario town, clinging to socks and sleeves and hair. Dogs' tails wag low and heavy. Cats flatten their ears as they bite at the spikes caught in their fur, trying not to pierce their tongues. As in all towns on the edge of wildness, nature intrudes in small and disruptive ways. Snails devour gardens, trailing slime. Residents pour beer into vats for snails to drown in or remove their shells and saute them in butter if they're feeling cosmopolitan. Escargots, they announce, sprinkling guests' plates with parsley and tucking Eiffel Tower cocktail napkins underneath. In Burr, everyone pronounces the T in escargot, even the ones who know better, not wanting to seem pretentious. If you drove down Main Street with its mix of gingerbread-trimmed Victorians, bungalows, rambling farmhouses, and simple storefronts, you might think there was nothing special about Burr, nothing much to differentiate it from the other villages and towns dotting the periphery of London, except that the people of Burr have chosen to live here. They are proud of this choice and keep scrupulous watch over everyone else seeking a quiet life. The people of Burr believe it best not to speak of unseemly matters. They try not to talk about that night in 1880 when a vigilante mob murdered a troublesome family with spades and picks and fire, dousing the homestead with oil and cheering as it burned. That's long gone, they say now if pressed, waving their hands dismissively. It's a nice, peaceful town. In Burr, there's Oxbow Elementary School and Medway High School and St. John's Church and Pete's Butcher Shop and Burr Food Mart and Dee Dee's Diner and the Flour Mill and Max's Variety and an Esso and a library and a cemetery where a young girl lies face down in the soil and dreams of being buried. I'm going to read one other section. This is from the mother's, this is an anecdote from the mother Meredith's childhood. This is based on a true story that I was told. This happened in Byron. When Meredith was a child, she had a cat named Esmeralda and a dog named Boris. One morning, while stirring cream into her coffee, Meredith's mom noticed the cat lying dead on the kitchen floor. Boris, their elderly border collie, was curled around the corpse, his black and white legs trotting after phantom bunnies. Meredith's mom spilled coffee on her slippers, murmured, "Jesus Christ." She fetched her husband, and they buried Esmeralda in the backyard before Boris and Meredith woke up. Later that day, while Meredith was drawing pictures of Esmeralda and splattering the crayon paper with tears, Boris dug up the dead cat from the backyard grave and carried her gently in his mouth to the door, scratching with one paw to come in. When Meredith opened the door, she backed away screaming. Esmeralda's head and legs poked stiffly from Boris's jaws. She ran and hid in the closet while the dog came inside, squeezing her hands over her ears to shut out the sound of Boris's panting and Esmeralda's rigor mortis limbs tapping on the closet door. Meredith's dad tried to retrieve Esmeralda from the clamp of Boris's jaws by dangling toys and even a ham bone, but Boris would not let go. In the middle of the night, Meredith's parents crept to the kitchen while Boris was asleep and carefully pried Esmeralda from the dog's paws. Meredith's mom held the flashlight while her husband shoveled in a different spot, deeper this time. Meredith's dad placed rocks on top of the cat's grave, but Boris dug around them to get to Esmeralda. Meredith's dad hid Esmeralda in a new grave behind a shrub, but during the annual garden party, Boris sniffed out the dead cat and lifted her from the earth, drooling. He trotted with her triumphantly into the circle of guests. "It's Esmeralda," a neighbor said grimly. Red velvet cake slid off a paper plate, and a couple of punch tumblers shattered as they hit the ground. Someone tittered. Conversations were abandoned. The guests made excuses, begged off. While Meredith's parents plucked forks and broken glass from the lawn, Meredith hid behind a tree. She peered around its bark to watch Boris play with Esmeralda on the porch, batting at her playfully with his paws and propping her against the wall with his nose, licking what was left of her face. Meredith felt guilty for being afraid of Esmeralda, especially next to Boris's unwavering devotion. After all, it wasn't Esmeralda's fault that she was dead, that her fur was matted and missing in some places, that her moon bones were showing through. "Sorry, Esmeralda," she whispered desperately into the bark as she wept and pinched her nose. Meredith's parents had wanted to keep Esmeralda in their backyard for their daughter's sake, so she could plant poppies and offer prayers. They thought it was important for Meredith to learn how to show respect for the dead. But it was impossible. Everyone had been horrified by Esmeralda's resurrection at the party and the trio of little open graves in the yard. They would no doubt remain wary of Boris too, misunderstanding his loyalty, suspecting he'd dug up Esmeralda to finish off what was left of her remains. The next morning, Meredith's dad laid the dead cat on a blanket in the car and quickly rolled the windows down. Boris poked his muzzle inside, whining as Meredith slipped into the back seat and somberly elbowed him out. They reached the woods as dusk was settling. The ground bore the tracks of foxes or wolves, and as they buried Esmeralda's fur-tufted skeleton, Meredith sensed eyes in the trees. The cat was sticky with rot and Boris's saliva when Meredith placed her, for the last time, in the grave. She gagged as the dirt wriggled with worms and covered her wild, wet face with her hands. Her father was silent as he shoveled some loose soil on top. Thank you.
That's a true story. You said that was lifted from a true anecdote?
Hello? Oh, yes. I was told by a dear family friend who's since passed about a friend of hers whose dog kept digging up the cat. And that was all I'd told, but that it was an act of love,
Yes.
but that it was creeping out the neighbors.
Truly.
And I just, I love that story, and so I embellished the rest, but
Oh, wow.
I felt like it kind of is the core of my book, like how what you try to suppress can keep coming up.
Yeah. Creepy acts of love. Next year's Words Fest panel, we need that as a topic for sure. Finally, D.A. Lockhart. D.A. is the author of 9 books, is that right? Lost count? Anyways, yeah, what a good problem to have. Including his latest work, North of Middle Island, with Kegdawans Press. His work has appeared in Tri-Quarterly, Grain, Belt, the Malahat Review, among many other publications. His books have been shortlisted for the Raymond Schuster Award, Indiana Authors Award, Robert Crouch Award, and the Relit Award for Short Fiction. He is editor-in-chief for Urban Farmhouse Press, based out of Wawayatanong, also known as Windsor, Ontario, and he is a registered member of the Moravian of the Thames First Nation. Please welcome DA.
I have to lower this. That's one of the things. Sheki Hetch, newly leitam alipan, as we would say. In my Unami Lenape language, it just means I'm very grateful to be gathered with you today. And I'm just going to read two quick poems from North and Middle Island for those that don't know. Middle Island is the furthest southern point you can get in Canada. It's actually a small island south of Pelee Island, so it's a very interesting place. And I'm not going to be talking about wrestlers on this particular reading, but the book has Rowdy Roddy Piper that takes up the majority of the book because Rowdy Roddy Piper is awesome, and he's a great liberator of the island, which when you read the book, you will be able to find that one out. But the first section of the book actually helps situate yourself on the island. How many people here have been to Pelee? We have a lot of Pelee people. That's good. It's a very unique place. The pheasant hunt, I believe, is still going on at the moment, which is more of a massacre than a hunt. Anyways, let's start with measurements. Measurements. Our great southern nation has proclaimed the northern to be 2 feet higher, and the border runs through the neutral sea. That we lose 20 meters of gravel to a flood measured in years rather than fronts. We live in fear of measurement, how it can be layered upon the earth we walk. The lake will be more green than the earth where Zug meets Rouge. We measure fear by clear mornings. Tamakwe was spotted at the north end beneath a slouching lighthouse. Monarchs arrive like dogwood pollen. Pelicans have begun to eat Gaga Shibug. And when the ferry arrives between windstorms and government austerity, we are certain that the measure of water between Westview and Kingsville is counted by light reflected in the mirroring of all too human distance. For those who may or may not know, this face on the front is actually one of our more important Manitus in Lenape. This is the Macing. And why I'm even bringing this up is because he is the holder of the, well, they. It kind of looks like a Sasquatch, but he rides a deer. There's a lot that goes into this, but he wears this mask anyways. He's the holder of the treaty between humans, or Lenape, Awenik as we say, and the wild parts of the world. So as we're sort of talking about reimagining our relationship with Souwesto and the Deep South here, it's always important to remember that there's a reason why this is on the cover. So I'm gonna just give you one more poem. And for those who don't know, Pelee Island is claimed currently by the Caldwell Nation. It is actually traditionally home is a kind of an odd word. It was more of a hunting ground to the Miamami. We as Lenape lived with them in Indiana, and we called them the Cranes. They had like rain. Don't worry about it. They're cranes. And this is a poem for them, okay? Ghost of Cranes. Ghost of Cranes. Frosted gray-green like beach glass uncovered by a Tehokan tempest, our neutral sea foments even sky with writhing body, visible in the breaches of white violence below. The distance between lake bottom and sky is shallowest here, without sand, and the flaking rock gives way to fossils and loose gravel. This is Land's End, the final steps before a northern country crumbles into the fickle waters beyond. Tread lightly here, lightly, like a beach shuffling turn, talons raking sand like a breath. No, the petrified past flakes away to grit, covers creation, and through the settled dust, consider Mame and Muxula, cutting the impossible gap between shore and middle island's shadow, our crane relations sublimated to dust and wave residue, apparitions that refuse to leave or stay.
Thank you so much for those readings. I'll complete the intros by telling you who I am. My name's Misha. I'm an author and musician here in town. And I'm really stoked to be chatting with you three. Let's start off by raising a physical or digital hand. Who has a strong, and I'll extend this to you three as well, who has a strong association with the genre regionalism or the term Souwesto? Okay, interesting. Yeah, there are all lots of different ways that we can describe or analyze a work, and regionalism is one, or regionalist is one categorization. But I'm curious about the extent to which you relate to this categorization, work within it. Aaron, maybe starting with you, what does regionalism mean to you, and if at all, and it doesn't mean anything is a perfectly fine answer, but if at all, how do you find yourself working and perhaps even innovating within the genre?
I don't know.
Next.
No, I mean, like, that's the short answer. The long answer is, like, there's a lot of regionalism that I really dislike, and the way in which people have thought about it. It's Sunday morning. I haven't had enough coffee, so I'm just going to say it the way I think it. But, like, there are some Canadian writers who will just use Heidegger to construct sort of theories of region and place, and we are worse off for them. So if I have like a relationship to it, it's maybe trying to think new ways to engage with, think about our responsibility to, and our understanding of the place that we are. Yeah, I think that's probably what I have to say.
So less of a working within maybe an existing framework or model and trying to be more innovative when you find the term being applied to your work.
Yeah, and just for me, it's just an engagement with where you are. So a form of responsibility that is both like taking account of. It's both trying to understand a place, doing the work, the research, but also having at least a somewhat critical stance to that, so that it's not just boosterism, so that it is taking account for, looking at the issues with it, the problems with it, at the same time that you're open to celebrating its more positive elements.
Right. Yeah, I saw you nodding along. Can you comment on what regionalism means to you, if anything?
Well, I'll go back to my first undergraduate, which was at Trent. And Professor John Wadlin, he's sort of one of the great thinkers of Canadian lit. He says that all things come from the land. So, and to that extent, I think that's where I start with regionalism. But as a writer, I was first trained in Montana. Yeah, so this is kind of bouncing all over the place. But there's this, one of my most significant influences is Richard Hugo, and he's considered to be one of the great regional poets in American history. And then Indiana, of course, everything's land-based there. So I think for me, regionalism is a compliment in a way. It speaks to the fact that how we talk and the stories that we tell, the metaphors that we turn to, are well researched, but they're also rooted, they're embedded in the land itself. So for example, when we look at this particular book, there's a lot of talk about Lake Erie and looking into this sort of very unique neutral sea that's, that's the traditional name for it, Wabashkigo Gichigami. But I think that all great literature sort of comes from regional, and in the United States, which is where I was trained, my majority, most of the argument is between, there's the East Coast, which is, the sort of highly educated Atlantic seaboard, and then there is the West, where you have Schneider and all those cats out in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oregon area. But then there's the interesting thing was that America actually has the Midwestern literature, and they have Southern literature, and then they have literature of the Great Plains. So there's all these literatures going on all the time, and the really successful ones are the ones that sort of embrace their region but can do it as a universal. Make sense?
And Brooke, picking up on our earlier conversation where we were candidly sort of, what are we doing here? Maybe you could comment on what regionalism means.
Yeah, and now that I've heard these great answers, I would like to lift my hand and say, please include me. I love it. I wasn't really aware of the term Souwesto, to be honest, until being invited to this panel. So I was madly Googling it, but I was quite excited. My mom has a big passion for visual art, and I saw a lot of, the artists that she showed me, like Greg Cournot and Patterson-Ewan are also talked about in this movement, which is so cool. And I've also been rereading a lot of Alice Munro, and I have a special, tenderness for some of the stories set around London that are often quite gothic. For me, it wasn't intentional to try to fit into, a label or a scene. I grew up between Arva and Ilderton, and spent my childhood here, and was very inspired by the Carolinian zone, how lush it is here. I also draw a lot of inspiration from the nature, the trees, the birds, the animals that live here. For me, it was kind of putting in the personal into my fiction that kind of led me to base it in this landscape.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on the fact that everything we read is inherently set somewhere, but by merely being set somewhere, the work does not rise to the definition of being a regional work. There's a centrality and a specificity of place that sort of puts you in this category, or I should say your latest works in this category. Aaron, picking up on what you were saying about responsibility, I'd like to talk about what comes up for you in terms of a sense of responsibility when you are playing with place, because of course, as authors, we blend realities, we take liberties, but playing with place can implicate a people, a history, a culture, an unfolding experience. So I'm curious what considerations come up for you. And Aaron, let's start with you. When you're deliberately crafting a representation of place.
You're asking really good questions, but they're very complicated. You're asking me first.
Okay, if we can, if someone else wants to jump in. I've been looking at this order for so long that it's programmed my brain.
It is an interesting question. I think it's a difficult question. I don't know that. I think in terms of responsibility, what I think about is if you're going to ground a work of fiction in place like that, it has to do with doing the work, which is both research, but also a kind of lived experience, so that you can really understand what you are writing about and bring that to what you're writing about. And bring that understanding of a place not just as something that you've created itemized lists of and done archival research on, but that you have built this sort of deep experiential knowledge of. And then if you bring that to it, you are of that place, so you are responsible to it and you're responsible to yourself, which is not always a comfortable position to be in, because it can mean looking at difficult aspects of the place that you belong to. But I think that's how I would answer that question, or at least start to think about answering that question.
Yeah, it is a big question. Brooke, anything come up for you when you're deliberately, Burr has its own chapter, along with all the other characters, right? And so, were you thinking, what are the folks of Burr going to think about this? How might it be received? Is there an audience in your mind as you're depicting Burr in such a way?
I just kept telling myself, you don't need to show anyone what you're writing. No one needs to see this, to give myself permission to play and be weird and try things. But of course, there's that moment of terror when you receive your books and you're like, oh no, what have I done? But it's also very thrilling. But I'm very happy to say that Burr is spelled B-I-R-R and mine is spelled like the plant. And this came from, as a child, being very kind of dreamy and hearing about this town, and I assumed it was named after the spiky plant. So it was always Burr in my mind. And to find out years later that it's not spelled that way at all. It probably has nothing to do with it. But I decided to keep it. One is a sort of, like a flag for the reader that if you're looking for a historical accurate representation, this might not be the book for you. I'm going to take a lot of license here. And also I like the image of the Burr, sort of like grief, something spiky that you carry around with you. So I kept it. But it was fun for me, and I did ask, my family a lot of what they remembered about the place, rumors they heard, and I sort of fed it into the imagination. But I also incorporated, I was a big reader, so all the Gothic stories and fairy tales, because for me that did kind of overlay over my childhood. I was so much in my head and in my imagination that my experience of childhood had this kind of fantastical overlay to it, which I wanted to keep in the story.
DA, how about you? Sense of responsibility, especially, Rowdy Roddy Piper, talk about taking liberties, reconstructing. By the way, when he said he wasn't going to read the from Piper, I almost walked off the stage.
Don't put up with that trash. So, you want to push the limits, right? A story about an island with 210 people that's inherently somewhat xenophobic because you can only get there by ferries or a plane. So there's an importance to doing this, right? And I think I found the same issue when I wrote Breaking Right, which is a collection of short stories set in Indiana, is that on some level I'm actually using real people. Now you have to somewhat bury them and make it so that they could sort of find themselves in there. I recently had a conversation with a publicist, by the way, that wants to send the book to the guy who actually played Gold Dust, Nikuli Punk, in the book. And I'm a little weirded out by that in the same way people ask me if Margaret Atwood's read the poem I sort of assassinated her with, or Don Cherry. I said Don Cherry's illiterate, so he didn't read it. Anyways, complete side note, and then Don, I'm looking at you. Anyways, the idea of when you write these that there has to be sort of, especially with Pelee Island, it had to be somewhat historically accurate, which when you do that, you fundamentally are arguing about some of the myths they've told themselves about the island. And I consider the fact that Pelee Island is actually 3 islands, but what they did is they put up a bunch of pump houses, and now there's a poem in there, by the way, about the pump house dominating the land. But to Pelee Islanders, their island is whole, and their history is whole. And then on top of that, now we have the extra added level of Indigenous claims. So now we have a new nation, well, new, I hate to say that. We have a very important nation of Caldwell. It's been re-recognized, and Leamington, and they're claiming Pelee Island, as they should. That's part of their thing. Their peoples were there, their ancestors were there. But then there's this also other interesting history that we import from Indiana, which is the constant movement of Indigenous peoples. So now we have the Maumee level on that. And Maumees aren't really recognized in Canada. Getting that right. And by the way, Rowdy Roddy Piper was on Pelee Island. So there's a point that this actually makes sense. He was there to film a romantic comedy. I wish it was They Live, and I wish he had a wrestling match there, but he didn't. So there's always some kernel of truth that becomes a bigger myth. In the same way that when you read Beowulf, or if you read a lot of the older epic poems, that there's always a kernel of truth, but I don't really think Beowulf actually fought a big monster under the water for hours. So it's a way to sort of exaggerate to bring out greater truths, I guess is the best way to put it. But to do that sensitively against the sensibilities and the knowledge and the beliefs of the people who inhabit those spaces. Yes, I partially inhabit Pelee, but I don't full-time inhabit Pelee. So that would be for other people who live there year-round.
So much to balance, and at the end of the day, can you stand behind what you've written or not, is the question. I have other questions, but I just want to briefly pause and open it up to the crowd. Does anyone have anything that they would like to ask our authors? We got a paw in the back from the legendary and only occasionally problematic Jason Dixon.
This is for all 3 of you, is there a story about the area that you haven't told yet that you'd like to tell in a book sometime in the future?
I start? Yeah, sure. I've got something that I'm working on now that's about Colonel Talbot, who, if you recognize the name from things like Talbot Road or Talbot College at Western, he was the man who controlled settlement in an area called the Talbot Tract after him that went from Windsor all the way up to Long Point, which is west or east of London and included London. So a huge portion of southern Ontario. He controlled settlement here from 1803 until depending on how you split it, about 1835 or 1838. So he was normally enormously important for the early settler history of this area, and yeah, a very, very strange person who had an almost dictatorial control of the region, and I find him fascinating for lots of interesting reasons. So, which I'm not going to share because it will take too long.
I'm working on, I'm not sure yet if it's a novella or a novel, but it's set in London as well, in the late 80s and onward. And it's inspired by my youngest daughter, who's a pallbearer. Pallbearers are babies that are born with their amniotic sac intact, and it's very rare. And in England, they're believed to never drown. It's very lucky. And they used to dry the calls and preserve them and sell them to sailors for a big sum to protect them. So my midwife told me this. I was very excited. And then I went down an internet rabbit hole and found out that in Romania and other Eastern European places, they believe pallbearers are destined to become vampires unless you feed them their call by their 7th birthday. So I'm not sure exactly why I'm setting it in London, but it feels like the right place to me. I love the echoes of London, England as well, and it being here, and I'm sure as I'm continue to figure out this story, I'm hoping to draw some more. Feed in some more facts and find out some more, uncover some more secrets about the place.
On behalf of Tourism London, we're very flattered you've chosen.
Thank you, Tourism London. So I'm working on a lot of stuff in terms of Pelee Island, but let's look specifically at sort of the dirty South, which is Essex County and Pelee Island. So it's dirty, it's filthy. I mean, I don't even know what a garbage can is. Anyways, so I'm currently working on the John Prince Centos. Does anyone here know who John Prince is or was? He's no longer with us, but for like 200 years. Okay, John Prince was a populist politician and lawyer from Sandwich. I have all of his journals and letters, and he was kind of a Donald Trump of his era, but not Donald Trump. He's a weird figure, okay, very problematic. He actually fought to liberate Pelee Island from the Americans, and he hates the Americans for his whole life. But what I'm doing currently is I'm taking his work and making Santos out of them, but framing them from an Lenape sort of consciousness. The Thames Review has some of them up. It's a weird project, but to sort of, I guess, hang the guy with his own words, he hates French people. It's unbelievable how much he hates French people and Americans. So, and which is a weird thing if you're from Canada. He becomes the sort of member of the legislature in Kingston for quite a few years, and his wife hates him so much he ends up dying in Sault Ste. Marie, and she stays in the Park Farm in Amherstburg, Sandwich area. So he's rolling with all the big names, and just to see him make name calling them, I'm sure you've heard of the Bobbies, the babies from Windsor. He actually shot one of them in the face on Belle Isle over a duel, and like he just shoots him in the face, drops the gun, gets on a boat, and leaves. The guy survives, and this guy, like, he's being massacred in the newspapers everywhere, and they just keep voting him in. Does this sound familiar? He also hanged a bunch of American prisoners of war. It just keeps going. Anyways, interesting thing to play with. And I've had so many Windsorites go, "Why are you writing a book about him?" I said, "Because you hate him." Because that's funny. And number two is a lot of people don't know who he is. So Windsor has a lot of missing gaps in its history. So that's what a lot of the regional writing that I'm doing is trying to sort of fill in.
Thanks for sharing those little freakish glimpses into what you're all working on. We have a question from our online audience from Paula. Here goes. Each author has read from their own works, which elucidate and incorporate past and present personal and recounted experiences in the weaving of their narratives. What future narratives does each author see emerging in Souwesto? Aaron, I won't just point the finger at you. Does anyone want to take on this question first in the spirit of fairness? What future narratives do you see emerging in Southwestern Ontario?
Well, I mean, for the dirty South, the truth, I'd like to see more truth in history, truth in our sort of collective past. There's a big issue with that. I mean, some people in the city government still there's an island called Pesh Island. They call it Peach Island for some reason. Oh, it's because there's peaches there. Well, Pesh means fishing, and the French named the island after what the Nish called it, which was a fishing island. So those sort of truths would like to emerge. But I think culturally, I mean, I look at Windsor, and we have a massive population of new immigrants, of folks who've come here with the great sort of, we have Iraqi, we have Syrian, we have a lot of great poetics that are still contained, and these experiences are still contained within their own languages and their own cultures. And to have that, I want to see that come in the next 10 years, the next 10 to 15 years, to hear those narratives, to bring those new mythologies to our region in the same way that we imported French and then we imported the British. And I mean, to an extent, the Lenape was imported here as well. So there's all these different mythologies I would really like to see emerge, and I'm very hopeful for that.
I like how you've interpreted the question. Yeah, not just what do you see in terms of maybe spotting a trend, but what would you like to see? Do either of you have a comment on that?
I think with respect to London, Ontario, simply more writing about it. It's always struck me as very strange that London's now, I think we've probably passed 500,000 people, and that's it's quite a substantial city, but it's a substantial city with a very, very limited literary history. There's just not a lot written about London. There has started to be more, like Brooke's book, my book, Erica McKean's book, Tear, is also set in London. And so more of that, because from some perspectives, London can look like kind of a boring place and kind of a non-place. I was having a conversation with people about this summer and looked up all the various towns called London around the world that you can visit. And there was a list of them, and of course London, Ontario was on it. And it had, for each town, there was a series of list of things that you could do there in that town, like visit, sites you could see, etc. And for London, the first thing was you can go to the Labatt Brewery. I'm like, it's like the beer store, but they only sell one kind of beer and it isn't good. But there just wasn't, like, you could see that whoever had put this list together just didn't see anything here to tell people to go and do, right? And so there's that perspective, but the reality is London is actually this really fascinating, complicated place with interesting histories and neighborhoods and people, and you're starting to see that, I think, emerge in the books that people are writing about it. And I would like to see more books like that, and I would particularly like to see books like that surprise me. That give me versions of this place that aren't the ones that I know, that show me dimensions of it, sides of it that I haven't thought of yet. And more of that would be wonderful. So, yeah.
How about you, Brooke?
Yeah, I mean, those are excellent answers. Yeah, I really love reading Erin's book because I think it does draw attention to aspects of London that I feel like are being suppressed and repressed, and I feel like this place often did feel very repressed to me, which made it a good site for the Gothic. But learning more about the military history and yeah, the jeeps that are being created right here, and talking about those issues, I think it's so timely right now to think about how our jobs here and our actions are impacting people in wars around the world. So yeah, I'd like to keep reading more books that are brave enough to talk about, yeah, both the history but also the present, the things that people don't want to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always struck by how, despite having a personal acquaintance with a place, which of course includes living there, how there can still be so much about that place that remains elusive or unknown. I'm curious, in the course of writing your respective works, if there is a fact, a feeling, an experience you had about a familiar place that was surprising. Newly enchanting, perhaps disappointing, I don't know.
Okay, I'll just jump. Actually, the most surprising thing to me was that Rowdy Roddy Piper was on Peely Island. That was
Filming a romantic comedy.
yes. And actually, how that even there's a poem in here that's sort of set around the moment that I find out that Rowdy Roddy Piper had been to Peely Island. My buddy, he came to the island to help me move teepee poles on the top of a Subaru from one side of the island to the other. And he's like, well, my buddies are on the island tonight, and they're at the Westview Tavern. We should go down there and see them. I'm like, who do you know on Peely Island? It turns out he's a huge wrestling nut. My buddy Drew Dwyer from Windsor, known him since kindergarten. But he was like, let's go meet my buddy, and he's going to tell us some stories about wrestling. And the first thing he tells us, and it's a whole boat cruise there from the Peely Islander too, he starts telling the story about Rowdy Roddy Piper getting drunk on Peely Island, like, 20 years ago in the 90s or something. Yeah, so, no, that's good. Yeah, way back. That tells you how old I am, I guess. But so he tells his story, and that was it. I was off to the races. I'm like, well, this was in like the mid-90s, around the time of the backlot brawl of WrestleMania and stuff like that. So it was really that was the surprise moment. I mean, I knew that the Detroit Tigers hung out there. Al Capone had a house there. They did all sorts of sketchy things on Peely Island because the police aren't there. So not a surprise Piper was there, but at the same time was a surprise that there was that sort of bigger connection.
But had you already, was discovering that what unlocked the Piper myth, or had you already been working with that?
Absolutely, that was the moment that unlocked it.
That was the moment that unlocked it.
Yeah, it was a summer night, and it was hotter than hell actually, and there was I wasn't drinking. I don't really drink much, but everybody else was. So I was the only sober one in a bar, and everyone was screaming about
the drunk one.
Yeah, it was very entertaining. But yeah, it was that moment where I'm like, oh God, Piper. Ooh, this could be interesting. And it started as a small poem, and then I was like, this isn't doing it. So when I grew up, Rowdy Roddy Piper was the coolest thing in the world. Because Windsor, when you want to be cool in Windsor, you pull out the bagpipes. And when Rowdy Roddy Piper would come down the walkway to wrestle someone, it would be like 70 pipers and all sorts. I think I appreciate that. I have no Scottish background whatsoever, but I really do appreciate the bagpipes. There's something that's just jerk enough about it that I like.
Brooke or Aaron, anything in the course of your research, whether that was, factual historical research or chatting with family members that, kind of surprised you about a place that you had expected to be a little more familiar?
I think like a lot of teenagers, growing up here, I thought London was boring as well. And then the more you learn about it, you're like, wow, this is fascinating. Like I remember hearing something much later about how London was the serial killer capital of the world. I know I'm really excited to read Vanessa Brown's book on that. And I just thought, oh my gosh. And I asked my parents about it, and they're like, oh yeah. They're like, there's the chambermaid slayer. And like, they just recounted these things. And I was like, oh my God, like where I grew up, it looks so bucolic, and it's called Forest City. It just made it feel very Lynchian to me all of a sudden. But I do remember always, just hearing about kind of biker gangs burying bodies like out in the country, or there was always, everyone's so nice here and it's so beautiful, but there was also this kind of simmering undercurrent that I always felt. So I don't know, I guess just learning more about that. And I think anywhere you live, if you really pay attention and you research, like I think everywhere is interesting, And I learned that Arva, near where I grew up, there was a stop for the Underground Railroad. Like, there's so many things that I didn't learn in school, but that I've since uncovered. And I'm excited to keep uncovering and learning more about the history of this place.
Yeah, as you uncover stuff like that, it kind of sensitizes you to looking for those secrets from formal education curriculum, I should say. But Aaron, how about you?
I mean, I think probably the thing that I discovered that surprised me most was the kind of the inciting moment of the book, and that was just discovering that General Dynamics Land Systems Canada manufactures armored vehicles in London and sells them to the Saudi Arabia government, who then uses them in the war in Yemen. And pulling on that thread led to some fairly shocking places, like learning about that war and its cost, but also going backwards as well and looking at the past and discovering, for example, that when the Canadian government sent the army into the siege of Kanesatake in the late 80s, early 90s outside of Montreal, they went in with armored vehicles that were the early generations of the ones that are currently being manufactured in London and were also manufactured in London. And there's a documentary you can watch and you can see those vehicles. So I got that one kind of little fact from an article called The Seat Damper by Michael Lista about that the company makes these vehicles and that they're manufactured in London, and just got that and then pulled that thread. And a lot of kind of shocking but also fascinating things came when I pulled that. So, yeah.
It's staggering that we can spend our whole lives in a town and not know some of its most delightful, disturbing, facts, right? It's kind of mind-blowing. We've got, just a couple minutes left, so I just wanted to, we've got maybe one more question. Anyone want to shoot up a paw, ask a question of our authors? Yes. Yeah. Oh, right, sorry. Erin's doing my job, thank you. The lectern. I could do it if I had to.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. My question is about research and your research process, be it talking with people, be it reading archival work. I'd love to hear more about that and how you engage in it. At what point does it come into the writing process? And yeah.
I'm starting. All right. So some of it's really straightforward, right? It is archival research. To write about things or to learn about things like the war in Yemen, you read a bunch of United Nations, Amnesty International, Project Plowshares kind of reports, things like that. Depending on what you're looking at, you also have to do non-traditional stuff. So you follow people on things like Twitter. So for example, there's a historian working out of York University who focuses on Canada-Middle East relations and tracks all sorts of industry-related things, economic relationship between them. But one of the things that he tracks consistently is arms sales, right? And one of the places that he puts that information is on Twitter. His name's Anthony Fenton, so you use non-traditional sources like that. The other really important flip side of it for me is just you have to pay attention as you're moving through a place, right? I think that my example of this, since in the book, is Victoria Park, right? Which is something that probably everyone in the room has walked through, I don't know how many times this year. You probably can't count, right? But if you actually pay attention to what's in Victoria Park, it's a lovely park, right? It's at the center of the city. It's a nice place to go. When I'm downtown, I like to go and sit on a bench, and the trees are wonderful. It is also encircled by monuments to war. Some of them, for example, the Boer War Monument in the southwest corner of the park, honestly shouldn't be there. And it particularly shouldn't have been rededicated in this century, which if you take the time and look, you'll notice that the United Order Daughters of Empire, who I think initially funded the building of that statue, rededicated it, I think in the year 2000, which is just far, far too recent. It should be there in the first place, right? But if you just start to stop and pay attention to what's around you, especially if you're writing about something grounding in place, it's one of the best ways to actually do research, at least begin that process, because it gives you a sense of what to look for, and it gives you those starting points that you can then carry into more conventional forms of digging into archives and pulling out the history books and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think research really feeds the work and the imagination. For me, I started with this image of this rumor about a town eccentric who slept with the body of a dead young girl. And I kind of moved outward, and I had two young girls talking about this, and one of them's recently lost her father. and I set it kind of in the landscape that I knew. And then what I love is when you're really in the world of the book, everything that you notice or encounter here kind of has a connection to that. And you're grabbing things and you're putting them in and you're collaging them. I did a lot of research. The two main characters, Ernest and Jane, who become friends, the town eccentric and the young girl, they run away to Toronto to try to attend a seance. It's set in the 90s. I couldn't find a lot of information about seances in the 90s. I did not run away from home. I was very more of an obedient child, so I didn't have direct experience with that, but I ended up using a lot of elements from kind of Victorian seances and death rituals, but then trying to update them with some 90s flavor, like clap-on lights and things like that, and with the music. And I also did spend time here. I went to the Black Donnelly Museum, and because I'm, always grew up with that story hanging over me too. I went to high school with some kids who had the last name Donnelly, and people whispered whether they were related. So yeah, I kind of incorporating all those myths, going down internet rabbit holes, visiting local museums, just, learning about the plants and species that live here. All of that is really exciting. Also, the library here had some kind of, they had a haunted walk, and I found a lot of information about haunted sites in London, like the Grand Theatre, and also, and now I know Jason, so I'm gonna ask him questions. But yeah, all of that it's so fun. I feel like that's one of the most exciting parts is the research. Also, farmers' almanacs were really cool to read too, because farmers are very superstitious as well. Yeah.
Research. Okay, research. Obviously, do a lot of the same stuff these guys do, right? We all sort of read a lot, but with a book like North and Middle Island, it has form poetry. So part of that research is to actually look at other form poets. So the last section is based upon Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf. There's part one. Part two is the weird one. We talked about this already, that we ended up watching wrestling. So you go to YouTube and look up wrestling matches. So a lot of the things that are described in the actual last section are actually word by, like line by line blows of an actual Rowdy Piper match. That means you have to look up what moves he does, what moves they do, what relationships there are between the different wrestling characters. And then naturally with Peely, it's about getting on the land. So experiencing swallows on the beach or experiencing beavers walking down the road. There's all these things that you need to experience. So the language part as well, I had to research Lenape. We don't actually have translated words for deer woman, so I had to learn how to do that. So a lot of that was part of the linguistic training. So Atu Wixen is what's deer hair. That wasn't even available either. But yeah, research comes in multiple ways.
And the research you've done really comes through in the richness of all your works, which I've really been enjoying in preparation for this chat, which has come to its conclusion, I'm afraid. Can we get a big round of applause for Aaron Schneider, Brooke Lockyer, D.A. Lockhart?